I'm Daniel Penny, and you're listening to Non-Toxic, a podcast where we connect the dots between the manosphere and the atmosphere. This week on Non-Toxic, I'm talking with the British Johnny Appleseed, barrister, nature defender, and houseboat dweller Paul Powlesland. Paul is frequently seen in court defending activists charged with things like blocking roads or disrupting sporting events to protest the UK government's inaction on climate change. In his spare time, he's the founder of Lawyers for Nature, a collective of lawyers, researchers, and campaigners that give legal assistance to people trying to stop the felling of trees in their local areas, as well as being the legal counsel for the activist group Right to Roam. And on weekends, he plants trees. I reached out to Paul to talk in greater depth about his work for Right to Roam, a group that is pushing for new laws to increase the public's access to natural spaces. Unlike in the US, England and Wales have a limited right-of-way for walkers to go on paths on other people's land, but it's constantly under threat, and in practice, often impossible to enjoy. And while England has some nice national parks, it's also the second most densely populated country in Europe, so these places get crowded. Right to Roam says that as long as they're not damaging property or leaving litter, everybody should have the ability to get out and enjoy the countryside. That land shouldn't be controlled by just a few wealthy individuals and corporations, because it belongs to us all. Paul and I also get into the unique appeal that this kind of activism can have for men, and the way that things like wilderness service and the protection of nature can tap into some positive virtues of masculinity. Maybe you impress girls by telling them how many trees you've planted. I don't know. It's an idea. Before I start the show, I just want to thank our listeners who have been along for the ride for Season 2. This is our last regularly scheduled episode of Season 2, but if you listen to the end of this episode, you'll find out more about our plans for a bonus call-in episode. And I'd like to ask our listeners who've been along for this ride, if you want there to be a Non-Toxic 3, if you want us to keep detoxifying the discourse, there's really only one way that we can do it, and it's with your help. So to pledge your support, go to patreon.com/nontoxicpodcast and become a patron today. Do it right now before you start this episode, and you'll help keep us in business for a Season 3. All right, here's our show. Paul Powlesland, welcome to Non-Toxic. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So you're a barrister by profession, the founder of Lawyers for Nature, and you frequently represent environmental activists who are charged with things like interrupting the snooker world championship. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship to nature and how you became involved in environmental law, and specifically law around protecting the rights of people in nature? And then maybe that can lead us to your work for Right to Roam.
So for me, it was the love and connection to nature that came first. So I was just a civil commercial barrister for 6 or 7 years, I think, with no environmental or rights of nature work at all. And then I really fell in love with nature during my 20s and started spending more and more time in nature and became more involved in environmental activism. And after a while, I realized that I needed to bring that environmental activism into my legal work more. So I started representing people who were trying to stop trees from being destroyed, and in 2019 founded Lawyers for Nature, and also around that time became what I would call guardian of a river in London called the River Roding, and set up a charity to protect and restore it.
And where is that river, in case our listeners want to go visit it?
It's in East London. It's the third biggest river in London after the River Thames and the River Lee, but not many people even in London actually know of it. It starts near a place called Stansted Airport in Essex and flows for about 40 miles to meet the Thames in Barking, which is roughly where I live on my boat. So I live in the river pretty much. and set up a charity to restore it and to protect it. And it was actually just after that that I then got involved in Right to Roam as a kind of quite logical extension of some of the activism that I've been doing to access and protect nature.
So I think at this point, it's worth defining what is the right to roam and what is the Right to Roam Act that you and your compatriots are campaigning for in England?
So Right to Roam effectively means extending the amounts or the places in England and Wales that we are allowed to access, to walk on, to have leisure time on, to spend time in. At the moment in England and Wales, we only have the right to access 8% of our land. So 92% of it is off limits. But interestingly, I'm being very specific about saying England and Wales because in Scotland, which is obviously part of the UK but has its own parliament, they do have a right to roam, and they've had that for 20 years now, which gives a default of access to land across Scotland. And therefore, people in Scotland have this right to roam, and we're campaigning to have that in England and Wales. And as you say, I helped draft a bill, which is a specific bill that we're now campaigning for, which effectively replicates the position in Scotland and says we want that in England and Wales too.
So this is a relatively new phenomenon, but the idea of, and at least as codified in law, the way you're talking
Yeah.
about it, but the idea of English people having a right to be in the countryside has a very long history. It's ebbed and flowed in popularity at various times. I would say it probably reached its height in the Middle Ages with things like the Commons, and probably hit its low point during the Age of Enclosure, with when thousands of English villages were literally wiped off the map and the land was walled off by wealthy aristocrats for, sheep grazing. Where does the modern right to roam come from in England? Because that was sort of a new idea about leisure and spending time outdoors rather than like having access to, graze your sheep or
Mm.
sow your fields.
Yeah, I mean, when you said earlier, the right to roam is a new idea, I sort of almost interrupted you. So no, it's not a new idea. It's part of a long journey that we've been on. As you say, there was much greater access to land back in the medieval times. That was gradually reduced. And then I'd say in the 19th century into the 20th, there became this idea that we don't just need to access the commons, access land in order to, graze sheep or collect firewood. We need it for leisure and joy and connection to nature. And there was quite a few decades of the 19th century, probably from around the 1860s to maybe 1880s in England, where a lot of what were previously commons for grazing sheep and all those commoner activities were starting to get built on. And a lot of campaigns happened where people literally went and tore down fences and rioted to stop their commons being enclosed. And then those commons, which were saved, were then usually turned into commons or parks for leisure. So there's quite famous ones in London, Epping Forest, also Hampstead Heath, and quite a lot of the current parks in London specifically, but also around the country, are sort of former commons that then became used for leisure. And then that then developed in the 20th century, where particularly people in industrial towns who obviously lived in a very urban and often quite nature deprived environment wanted to go and spend time in nature on their weekend. And so you had things like the Kinder Scout mass trespass in the 1930s, where hundreds of factory workers trespassed on a moorland on Kinder Scout to basically demand access to that as part of their leisure time.
There's actually a super famous folk song called Manchester Rambler. Let's just listen to the chorus.
I'm a rambler from Manchester way. I get all me pleasure the hard moorland way. I may be a wage slave on Monday, but I am a free man on Sunday. The day was just
It's quite an iconic moment in the history of English civil disobedience. So I think it's a story worth unspooling slightly. What was going on, and how is it that a group of people came to do a mass trespass, and what were the results of that?
Well, it was effectively, I think it was a duke, and I forget which one, I'm sorry, but a duke who wanted to use it for shooting a lot of English uplands are used for shooting and those kinds of leisure pursuits, which the aristocrats don't want or didn't want ordinary people to interrupt or to cause problems with. And so the gamekeepers used to keep people off of the moors, and factory workers wanted access to go rambling and to spend time in nature. And they weren't able to change the law to give access, so they decided to go en masse and just do it, just trespass. They did that, and then there was quite a lot of violence, with quite a lot of the ramblers beaten, and people ended up in jail. But it became this totemic event, I guess, in the struggle for access, and was one of the things that gradually worked its way through the system to actually give both national parks and some of the access that we now have, even if we wish to extend that.
Okay. So that was 1932. And in 2000, you had the Countryside and Rights of Way Act, which gave people some rights to
Yeah.
roam in what you said is, about 8 or 9% of England. What
Yeah.
exactly does that act entail? Like, what rights do people have here? I think for American listeners, this is a really foreign concept, because in America, if you wander onto someone's property in a lot of states, they have the right to shoot you.
Yeah. I mean, luckily we've never had that in England. In England, generally, trespass is a civil matter. So actually, the owner has the right to remove you, but it's not even a criminal offence, which I know is very different in America. I was always very surprised when I went to America and I realised you could get arrested for trespassing. I found that quite shocking in the land of the free. It didn't seem as free to me as I thought it might be. So what the Countryside of Rights of Way, which is termed CROW, little acronym, did was effectively say that on certain types of land, things like moorland, heathland, downland, you could go on it. And that differs from the right to roam that we're now calling for, because the right to roam that we're now calling for says there should be a default of access, not a default of exclusion. So the default should be you are allowed to go onto land except for certain exempted categories, because obviously you shouldn't be able to go everywhere. You shouldn't be able to wander into people's gardens or onto military sites or onto sites where there's delicate ecology or onto active farmland, those kinds of things. And that's exactly what they have in Scotland at the moment.
Okay. So the assumption is that you're just a normal person going about your day, whereas currently the presumption is that unless there's a very specific carve out, you're a ne'er-do-well of some kind.
Exactly. And, those carve-outs, a lot of time they don't make a lot of sense. There's things called access islands. So you can have land which you are technically allowed to access because it's a certain type of land, but it's surrounded by land that you're not allowed to access. So unless you can parachute in, you wouldn't actually be allowed to go on it. And also a lot of people don't know if to get the map out and find which land you are and are not allowed to go on is actually quite a difficult task that a lot of people can't really do. And also, important categories are also excluded from it. So woodland isn't included, nor are rivers. So the position on rivers is actually worse than for land. You're only clearly allowed on 3% of rivers. There's an arguable case that you might be allowed on more, but a lot of the time that can lead to very difficult situations where you have arguments on the ground between canoeists and landowners and swimmers and landowners, and everyone's a bit confused. And the right to roam approach is saying, actually, these rivers, these woodlands, this land ultimately belongs to us all. And we should all have the right to actually spend time on the land with the nature in the countryside and to grow that connection and love towards it.
One of the things that opponents will often bring up, they'll say, there'll be litter everywhere, there'll be dog crap, people don't know how to behave in the countryside, and if we open up all this land, it's just going to be chaos and destruction. What do you say when you get confronted with those sorts of arguments?
What Right to Roam is proposing is that not just a kind of free-for-all, that there will be a new, what's called countryside code. So a code of conduct where people's right to access the land is predicated on them treating it well. So not littering. There would be more restrictions on dogs being able to go onto land with people, and to work with landowners to make sure that on sites where there is ongoing problems or damage, particularly what we call honeypot sites, where there's large amounts of access, that landowners are properly supported to ensure that things aren't damaged and that litter is removed and that kind of thing. But the first thing to say is that if anyone who grew in the countryside, it is certain sections of landowners and farmers and agriculture, not all of them, but the biggest damage to nature, to the countryside, is caused by things like shooting estates, by industrialized farming. They're the ones that cause huge damage. And a lot of the time, that damage is happening without anyone even realizing it. So many's the time that I've been trespassing on land that I shouldn't be on, and yet discovered something either illegal or incredibly destructive that the landowner themselves is doing. I actually walked along and mapped the entirety of my river, the Roding, and I had to trespass probably well over half of the walk, and discovered dozens of instances of landowner behavior that are completely unacceptable. Ploughing right up to the river's edge, fly tipping, illegal bank works and flood defences, like you name it. The other thing to note, of course, is this idea of connection. Where people do damage nature, the reason for that is usually because they are disconnected from it. So people who love and are connected to nature don't throw litter, don't throw dog crap everywhere. And actually, the current system of trying to exclude people from nature and then hope that people will treat nature well, it just isn't working. And the more we disconnect people from nature, the more we have a kind of industrialized society where many people don't spend time in wild nature, the more we're going to damage it. And that can be direct damage through things like, rubbish, but it can also be, and probably more importantly, indirect damage. The climate and ecological crisis, one of the key reasons it's happening is a disconnection from nature and from the earth. And we can only hope to solve those crises if we reconnect people to nature. And we can only reconnect people to nature if they can actually go into it and spend time in it.
After the break, I talk with Paul about not just the rights of people to enjoy nature, but whether nature has rights of its own. This episode of Non-Toxic is sponsored by Blue Corn Candles, a Colorado-based company that's been making handcrafted beeswax candles since 1991. Most candles in the market are made of paraffin, a diesel byproduct that's literally scraped from the bottom of the barrel. Blue Corn candles are made from sustainably harvested and lightly filtered beeswax. The candles smell great, burn super slowly, and most importantly, they don't produce any toxic fumes. Blue Corn is running a special deal for non-toxic listeners. Enter the code NONTOXIC, that's one word, all caps, at checkout to receive 10% off your order. Shipping within the US and internationally. Can you talk a little bit about moving away from just using nature as a place for outdoor recreation to making nature the site of kind of active conservation efforts, and how it is that you are proposing people get involved?
I think in Right to Roam, there's been a kind of movement for a while of turning it from it being purely a human-based land justice campaign towards one of conservation. So we need access to nature in order to connect with it, protect it, and restore it. And actually, some of the leading figures in the campaign came from the conservation sphere rather than just the land justice sphere. And that's also how I came into it. I'm more involved in that sort of ecological rights of nature guardianship aspect. That's why I came into Right to Roam. So that's being termed in a new campaign Wild Service, and it's also the title of a book introducing the concept where 12 members of the Right to Roam team have each written a chapter about what wild service means to them. So it's sort of easy to read the book in order. It's coming out in April in order to fully understand it. But for instance, because I'm a lawyer, I've done from ownership to guardianship. So why we need to move from a system of ownership, which is a kind of one of dominion, where the human owner has, by and large, almost an absolute right to destroy or damage their land, subject to some minor environmental law restrictions, which are mostly not enforced, towards seeing themselves as guardians of the land, and how we can use indigenous concepts of guardianship as a basis for that idea. And that is then also informing, so the wild service concept is also informing our campaigning over this year and over coming years. So previously, a lot of our events over the last couple of years have been what we've termed mass trespasses. So, going onto places, onto land that we're not allowed on in massive groups. I think the Dartmoor one was the biggest with over 2,000 people, I think, last year, to say we want access to the land. We did an event last year called Love Your River, which was the start of this, but we're going to be doing more and more this year. So on my river, we're having one in March where we're going to trespass onto the land, but then do acts of care and guardianship towards nature. So we're going to trespass and then we're going to pick up the rubbish that the landowners have allowed to accrue there, huge amounts of it in some places on the river. And we're going to plant trees, build wildlife habitat, and generally care for nature. And that's where we want the campaign to go over the next couple of years. And it then moves beyond purely a land rights issue to trying to fundamentally change the relationship between humans and nature. Nature is not just a dead resource to be extracted for human ends. It's alive, it has its own interests, and it's arguably sacred in some way and deserves to be protected and to have rights and be restored. Now, the reason I said that about rights of nature is that I see wild service as bringing rights of nature to this land justice movement, to say that actually when we exclude humans from land, we are also, a lot of the time, we are regarding nature as a resource and we are ignoring nature's interests. So we're saying that the only person that has an interest in the land or who can decide it is the landowner, and they have an absolute right to do what they want with their, inverted commas, land, even though a lot of the time it has a lot of nature on it, which has its own interests and should have its own rights. So that's what wild service is trying to do, is to reconnect people with nature and to say that when they took away our right to access the land, they took away our right, some might say our duty, to care for nature and to protect and restore nature, which is the work of our lifetimes. And I've been sort of thinking about that connection between toxic masculinity and what a good form of masculinity would look like, and how that can relate to caring for nature. You may not want to use these thoughts because they're slightly half formed, but I don't know if you have any questions on it.
Well, I mean, when you were talking about this idea of service, I think that there's a lot of discourse in kind of academic and popular analysis of so-called, the crisis of masculinity and problems with young men. And a lot of sort of qualitative research brings up this idea that young men feel they have no purpose and that they're kind of useless in a sense. And they may feel that because of economic reasons, they can't get a job, or because they feel like their so-called masculine virtues aren't valued anymore, and they don't really know what it looks like to be a man in a positive way. They only have kind of negative figures to follow, people like Andrew Tate or the like. And I do think, some of what you're proposing is it does lend itself to this idea of well, if a good man is a man who is as you say, a guardian, not an owner, right? And it's there are a lot of ideas about kind of what you should protect and how you should look after things that I think, they kind of tap into some of these ideas about what a positive vision of masculinity could look like.
Yeah, I feel that quite strongly in my life, actually. I've been trying to sort of carve out. I feel very, very masculine in my gender identity, and just generally I feel like a very masculine person. But I've never been into some of the more stereotypical aspects of masculinity, of how they're often defined in mainstream culture, which has often left me feeling a bit like having to kind of create or find my own. And actually, for me, I feel like nature guardianship and what we're now terming wild service does really fulfill that for me on a number of levels. I feel like a lot of men have a deep desire for action to shape and mold the world around them. and to be physically active in doing. That's often expressed in things like, I guess, going to the gym. But what happens? What if nature was our gym? And I often think that we have the work of our lifetimes, the work of the century, is to restore nature. We know that nature is in a desperate state. There is so much activity to be done, a lot of it quite hard physical activity. And to me, that feels like the perfect activity for a lot of men to do. So, why pay money for the gym when we need to plant trees? I've never been to a gym. I'm very physically active because I feel like I've got so many trees to plant, so much rubbish to pick. Like when you're working out on the land with nature, you're using like so many different parts of your body, and in a much more naturalistic way, that you're not just kind of like concentrating on one bit in a repetitive, quite unnatural motion. And after a day looking after nature or doing a restoration activity, I'm like exhausted, but my body feels happy, content, whole.
Yeah.
This weekend, I was out on the river, picking huge pieces of like tires and rubbish and trolleys and all this stuff out of the river. And I was exhausted by the end of the day, but sort of very happy to be using my body. And I feel like in many ways that desire to shape the world around you is actually quite a masculine urge. And what if we try to direct that masculine urge to change and shape the world around us from a destructive one, where a lot of the time many male activities around construction and building are quite destructive towards nature, towards restoration, towards enriching life. And I've started to think of this concept of a human beaver. Beavers are a keystone species which, through creating their habitat as they want it, also enrich life. So by creating their beaver dams and ponds, they create a rich wetland habitat which many other species rely on. And I think humans should be, and particularly men, should be looking at the same thing, seeing themselves as human beavers. How can we alter our immediate surroundings so that they are not only better for us, but also richer for nature? So for me, that's planting trees out on the river, which is quite a physical activity, and enriching of nature, and using my unique abilities as a bipedal thinking ape to try and enrich the natural world around me, to plant trees and do things like that. I feel like some of the activism I've done and the direct protection of nature I've done is often coming from a very masculine place within me. So this time last year, I was involved in a campaign to try and save some trees in a town called Wellingborough in the UK. And basically, it's quite a slightly long story. I'll try and cut it as short as I can. But basically, I wrote a barrister's opinion, a lawyer's opinion, saying that the tree shouldn't be chopped down. And basically, the police ignored that opinion and were going to help a developer to fell the trees illegally. So I went there to the town to explain my advice. They threatened to arrest me for standing under a tree. So I climbed the tree instead and occupied it for a full day. And there was a real sense of a kind of masculine, peaceful but very resolute thing of, you are not taking this tree, you are not destroying this tree, I will protect it, and I will do whatever is within my power without violence, but whatever is within my power to protect and save this tree, because it needs to be saved. And I wonder how many men might find it satisfying to step into that role of a peaceful but very powerful and resolute role of nature guardianship, of saying, no, these trees, this nature is under my protection, and I will do whatever it takes without violence to protect it. And I think that's, to me, it spoke to, I think, something deep in my masculinity to do that. And I wonder if masculine competition could be moved away from more destructive activities like accrual of money or wealth or material goods towards, I have the richest part of nature,
Yeah.
like
I planted so many saplings this weekend, bro.
I've planted the most trees. I've saved the most trees from being cut down. Like my nature, like my hedges all around me are so rich with birdsong. Like I have the most amount of melodic birdsong of anyone in my neighborhood. And I wonder also if many women would admire us more for that. Sometimes When I go on a date, I like to show all the trees I planted. These are the things I've done. This is what I've planted, as a way of showing off, rather than saying like, here's my ugly expensive car.
Yeah, I think that's a good pickup. Look at all the trees I planted. And it makes me think also of that tree that was felled in Hadrian's Wall.
Yeah, sycamore gap tree.
Yeah, the sycamore gap tree, and it was destroyed by some like teenage boy, right?
We do see destructive activities often from young men towards nature as a way of almost like rebelling, of like damaging things. And I wonder of ways of we can instead connect, particularly young men, with nature. And I think that actually, if we tap into it, the desire of everyone, but I think also men in particular, to protect, to enrich, and to care for nature is actually a very deep one. It's what our species was doing for 99% of its existence, shaping the world around us, but in a way that was sustainable and ultimately caring for it, because we realized that our own existence fundamentally hinged on nature's. And it's only in the last very, very short amount of time in our history that we've become disconnected from that. And I feel like it's the most important thing we need to do this century, is to reconnect with that purpose, with that idea. And it needs to be done through all different spheres, from law, politics, economics, social systems. Whatever system you're in, there's probably a way that you can work that reconnection to nature, that regarding nature as alive, as sacred, as fundamentally connected to human existence, into your system. And to link it all back in the way that Right to Roam is doing it, through this wild service concept. And we'd love for other people to take that concept on and spread it as much as possible.
How can people get involved in Right to Roam if they listen to this episode and they're like, I want to join up? What can they do?
So if you want to get involved, you can go to the website righttoroam.org.uk to sign up for the mailing list. There are national events. For instance, there's one coming up in a couple of weeks on Dartmoor, a trespass there, but there are also local groups you can get involved in to either go to local trespasses or organise your own, and also get involved in the campaign, lobby your MP for introducing the Right to Roam bill, and also crucially start doing wild service with your local nature, finding ways to connect with the nature that is closest to you, and ways to protect it, care for it, restore it. Yeah, that's the most important thing to do.
Thank you so much for coming on Non-Toxic. This was a great conversation. I'm glad we kept the tape rolling to the second half. That was good stuff.
I just thought it was, given the topic of the podcast, my only hesitation with it is that I feel like they're quite half-formed thoughts for me. Like I think it's barely discussed. I've never seen it really written anywhere. I'd love to know if there's some resources on it about this idea of a healthy masculinity actually being about this caring and connecting for nature.
Thanks so much for coming on the show. What does it look like to be a man who dedicates himself to nature? I think that Paul Powlesland is certainly a fantastic example. Someone who, in his career, in his spare time, seemingly in every waking moment, is working on behalf of the planet. And as he says, it's the job of a lifetime. I think for a lot of us, looking for purpose, looking for a way to be of service, this idea maybe has some legs. And of course, for those of us who just want to enjoy nature, I think Right to Roam does a really excellent job of showing how it's not just about getting out into wild spaces. It's about asserting the rights of all people, not just wealthy people, not just landowners, to enjoy those spaces and to be able to connect to them. And without that connection, you're never going to be able to build the political will necessary to do things like end fossil fuel subsidies or build the green infrastructure that we need And so I think, yeah, as Paul says, it's all connected. And that's it for this episode of Non-Toxic. This is the final episode of season 2, but we are planning a bonus episode. And for this bonus episode, we'd like our listeners to send us voice notes of questions about how to be less toxic or more sustainable. We're going to keep this very open-ended. This could be very prosaic things like how to buy a heat pump to deep stuff about being a better father. Really take this wherever you guys want to go. Andrew and I are going to spend some time looking for the best ones, and we're going to air a few and talk about these questions together. It's meant to be kind of lighthearted, but you can also ask those heavy questions, those burning questions, whatever is on your mind. And one lucky listener will receive a non-toxic t-shirt, which Andrew and I will send to you when the episode launches. So if hearing your voice on this illustrious podcast wasn't motivation enough, then hopefully a free t-shirt will be. To be included in this episode, send an audio recording of your question to nontoxicpodcast1@gmail.com. That's nontoxicpodcast1@gmail.com. As always, Non-Toxic is hosted by me, Daniel Penny, and produced by Loose Thread Studios with help from Andrew Lewis. Our music is by Nathan Sharp, and our artwork is by Sam Creasy. We had a lovely sponsor this season, Blue Corn Candles, but the most important sponsor is always our listener. So if you'd like to keep Non-Toxic going for season 3, sign up today at patreon.com/nontoxicpodcast. Help us keep detoxifying the discourse. And rate and review the show so other people can hear about it. Thanks for listening to this season of Non-Toxic. Keep your eyes peeled for bonus episodes dropping soon.